Welcome to Wine for Normal People, the podcast for people who like wine, but not the snobbery that goes with it. I'm your host, Elizabeth Schneider, author of the Wine for Normal People book and certified wine dork.
And I'm MC Ice, just a wine-loving normal person.
The show is sponsored by Wine Spies. Go to winespies.com/normal to get $20 off your first order. Listen in the middle of the show for more details. For decades, Aldo Vacca has been the fearless leader of the Produttori del Barbaresco, the best and most successful wine co-op in Europe. With his leadership and guidance, the Produttori has taken its wines and with it the wines of the entire region of Barbaresco to world renown. Aldo's job at the Produttori is not just an occupation, it's his legacy and a choice he made that has benefited everyone who loves Nebbiolo. Aldo took a degree in viticulture at Torino University and worked at UC Davis. And then he got one of the most coveted jobs in Piedmont. He worked for Gaja in 1986. But after 4 years, he realized that rather than fame or modernism, he wanted to do something that celebrated the land of Barbaresco and all it represented. And so he followed in the footsteps of his great-grandfather and used his infinite knowledge of Nebbiolo and his skills at management and hospitality. He is literally the best in the business to transform the Produttori into one of the best-known brands in Italy. I have spent time with Aldo. He is brilliant. He is cheeky. He's passionate. And after 2 years of bothering him, I am so happy to have finally gotten him on the show. Welcome, Aldo.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for the presentation, by the way. I'm a little embarrassing, but I try to keep up with it.
We've met. You know that that's my job. My job is to embarrass you and say how great you are. So There we go. And I'm going to see you again in fall of 2023, which I'm very excited about.
Fantastic.
So let's start with what's going on now. You're at the end of Harvest 2022. So
Yes.
How was it? How's it looking?
Yeah, it was challenging because we had this incredibly long dry season. In fact, we had some snow on December 3rd, 2021. And then we had some rain on May 2nd, 2022. And that was pretty much it, believe it or not, for the season. So an extremely dry summer that was preceded by a very dry spring and winter. So very challenging vintage, which resulted in a small crop and in an early harvest. We started picking the Nebbiolo grapes, which are the last pick in the region, on September 20th, which is 1 week, 10 days earlier than average. And by October 4th, we were over. So the harvest has been over since over a month. We're actually racking now the wine off the skins.
But you got everything in because you had told me there was some rain, which is good. That's really important. But
we had a little bit of rain a couple of days before the end of the harvest. So we stopped picking and then we started again when the grapes were dry. That rain, of course, didn't change the general situation of the vintage. So a dry season, which normally, dry is not a bad thing for grapes. Grapes like and dry conditions, but these were a little too extreme. So small crop, small berries, high sugar level in the grapes, not so much color to start with, although during this first racking, the color is actually not too bad, better than what we expected. But to give a final judgment on the 2022 vintage, I think we really need to wait for the spring once the wine is completely finished, after malactic and after all the stabilization, to see if you're going to have a very good one, a decent one. We'll see. It's hard to tell this year because, again, very challenging situation.
do you feel like because there's been so much climate change in Piedmont, I mean, is this the new normal? Have we stabilized or are things just weird still?
Things still go up and down, but the new normal is longer summers. And the new normal is September being a summer month. And sometime like this year, summer lasts until end of October, which, before global warming or whatever you want to call this new phase that we are living now, by middle of August, the season was changing. And by the beginning of September, we started to have the fog, the nebbia, and the cold and the rain was kind of a usual feature in September. Now, that foggy, rainy season doesn't come until November, sometime even December. So longer summers that overall give us a riper, more balanced wine, but definitely higher in alcohol and probably a little short in their lifetime. Now, the viticulture had to adjust a little bit, and winemaking as well has to be adjusted to this new situation. And of course, it took a few years to the winemakers to realize now this trend started in 1997 and became more and more common. We're still up and down. So we still had like slightly cooler, slightly warmer vintages, but overall the tendency is toward warmer climate and higher alcohol in the wines.
It seems like it's what everybody is talking about, how different things are. There's always been vintage variation.
Yes.
But do you feel like there's any part of, we'll talk about Barbaresco and the terroir, but is there any part of Barbaresco that you feel like is just hotter or colder, or are you seeing a difference between it? It's such a small area, but I just wonder if there's any place where you've got 9 single vineyards where you're saying, gosh, that's definitely different from 30 years ago.
Yeah, it's more a general situation. The Barbaresco appellation is basically 5 miles by 4. So it's really a small area, and the microclimate is relatively uniform. So what we are seeing is just a tendency where, in general, the grapes tend to ripe more. And so what were like the warmer exposure are still the warmer exposure, but they're giving us 14.5% alcohol wine instead of 13.5. And the cooler exposures, they're normally often in the past were hardly reaching 12.5 alcohol in the wine. Now they are 13.5, even 14. So it's a general uplifting of the alcoholic level. But together with that is a general extra ripeness in the tannins overall, and then more ripe or darker fruit that we are getting in the wine aromatics. I mean, overall, it's not been a bad thing. The average quality of Barbaresco and Barolo, by the way, I think is higher now than 30 or 40 years ago, because also the less favorite vineyards are producing much better quality. In certain vintages...
Yeah, I mean, are they going to turn into the better vineyards?
Yeah.
That's like the confusing thing. It feels like you've always had things planted all around because it's so little.
Yeah.
But now, like you were saying, the southeast facing, whereas before that was just death. Nobody wanted that. And maybe even north facing is okay.
Yeah, now it's okay. Of course, terroir still plays a major part of the deal. So you got to have the right microclimate, but also the right terroir. But for example, we have some famous single vineyards that we produce, such as Rabaya or Pora or Asili. All these hillsides, they have a top and a bottom. And traditionally, the best grapes from within the single vineyards were coming from the top of the hill. Often, like in 2022, the best grapes are coming more in the lower part of the hill where there is a little more moisture. So within the same single vineyard, within the same terroir, sometimes in some certain vintages, the warmest vintages, the quality is better where usually was the other way around. So it's nice to have the flexibility, to have multiple plots. It's nice to have a plot of grapes on the top of the hill, one at the bottom, one facing full south, and the other one facing more east or even northeast. So you can kind of cherry pick here and there and find whatever is the best balance in your wines. If you have one single vineyard, one single plot with one single exposure and one single altitude, then you're a little more exposed to the variation of the climate. In certain vintages, you can have excellent quality. In certain vintages, you can have overripe grapes or underripe. Having, like Produttori, a vast area where we source the grapes gives us extra flexibility in that.
That makes me think of one debate that you hear a lot about, less in Barbaresco, a little more in Barolo. There is this debate about all of these single vineyards and how they have taken over a lot of the tradition, whereas the ability to do a blend of all of the areas that you can source from is really the traditional way that you used to do it, right? I mean, you still do it, but it does limit you. If you would stake your entire reputation on one single vineyard, that would be very difficult, especially in this climate.
Yes. And, the single vineyard concept became very fashionable in our region in the 60s, 1960s. Prior to that, the idea that certain vineyards were better than others or certain vineyards gave different qualities compared to others. So one vineyard may give you a little more tannin, one vineyard can give you a little more aromatic or brightness. So the idea until the late 50s, early 60s was to source grapes from those different quality vineyards and blend them together to make the perfect Barbaresco or the perfect wine. Starting from the middle of the 60s, we started in 1967 to produce single vineyards, and then this idea of single vineyard bottling wine really exploded in the 80s and the 90s. It was there are fascination in both. Of course, when you do the blend, the focus is more on the region and on the winery, the brand, the name of the producer.
Yep.
When you go to the single vineyard concept, in a way, you give more importance to the land. That's what they do in Burgundy, for example. And the fact that from the 50s to the 70s, so through the 60s, there was the beginning of this major switch where before the majority of the land was owned by farmers selling grapes, and the wine was made by wineries buying grapes. And by the early 80s, most of the wine was made by people owning land. So through the 60s and the 70s, a lot of farmers became winemakers. A lot of wineries started to buy or tried to buy more and more land in order to become estate bottling. So in this situation, instead of buying grapes, you own land. It's clearly understandable that you want to give more importance to your piece of land, and especially if it makes a good quality wine or a very specific wine with a certain personality, then you write that name on your label, and eventually your land is also more valuable. So there's good things in single vineyard bottling, and there is interesting thing in blending. Now, the debate is still open in the region, but the vast majority of the producer of Barbaresco and Barolo as well like to make single vineyards because it gives them an identity, a connection to the land that they own. They may, like us, we make 9 single vineyards, so multiple single vineyards, and we don't make them every year. And within the single vineyard, we cherry pick the best grapes that we think suitable for the single vineyard bottling. But the tendency is there to stay, I think, in the single vineyard concept. But of course, again, was almost always the top of the single vineyard hill grapes to be used for the single vineyard bottling. These days, sometimes we may use the lower part of the hill with the same terroir, but a little cooler microclimate, which in these new conditions may be better.
The other thing about the single vineyards is the most fascinating thing that you do and that I have done with you is that you line up the single vineyards next to each other and let people try them. And you can see an enormous difference between them. Now, while you were saying that, the thing I was thinking is Barbaresco has a small enough area so that the single vineyards actually mean something. But for your neighbor in Barolo, some of them are so large that it's meaningless. So I think that's also an important thing to point out is that it only matters if there is not just a marketing reason for doing it, but also a terroir reason. And I would say that in Barbaresco, it's a pretty safe bet to buy single vineyard wines and know that they're going to express something very different, as opposed to some of the vineyards in Barolo where it's just huge.
Yeah, especially if you refer to the most historical vineyard sites. Because the point is that these vineyards name that we now use on labels to define the single vineyards, they've been used locally to refer to these vineyards for over a century. And that they became widely used on labels in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s. But they were officially mapped by the Consortio, the local Viticulture Association, only for Barbaresco in 2006 and for Barolo 2010. So relatively recently, these vineyards became official, the names and the bordering. It took now a few years of work. When you have to make sense of an existing situation, it's always a little difficult, and you need to compromise because, of course, when the work of mapping the single vineyards was done in the region, there was a discussion between two different points of views. A, should we map only the historical vineyards and forget about the others, just leave them in the just generic Barolo, Barbaresco, or should we map all the areas where Nebbiolo is grown, even if they are not currently famous? And of course, there is a point in mapping only the vineyards which carry an extra value from decades before. But since, fortunately, we live in a democracy, it was decided that we should map all the vineyards where the Nebbiolo is grown, because we cannot simply tell to those people, your vineyard is not worth enough to have a name. So the region has been mapped completely. That's why there are 66 official single vineyards in Barbaresco and over 140 official single vineyards in Barolo. Many of these, they are just large areas which they don't really carry a specific extra quality or a specific history or specific terroir. But the already famous one, the Rabaia, the Asili, the Pora, or in Barolo, the Brunate, the Canubi, they are more specifically mapped and defined with terroir. The consortium had to compromise between the necessity to define the famous vineyards and the fairness to give a name to all the vineyards existing in the appellation.
I don't have a problem with that, but I would say even like in Canubi and some of Abusia, there's some areas that got put in there that I'm not sure should be in there. But anyway, that's a story.
It's true.
They just made it big because people were already using those names.
Exactly. Compromises needed to be made,
It's a nice thing to do, I guess.
But overall, the important point about this mapping and official names is that now, whenever you write the name of a vineyard on a label, you have to prove as a winemaker that you actually own the land or you purchase the grapes there. So there is a strict control of the origin, which is a good thing.
Absolutely. All right, let's go back. We're going to take a step back. I wanted to know about the harvest. I was excited to know about that, and we'll take a step back here. Can you tell us about your family in Barbaresco? And you give such a great history lesson. So share how Barbaresco has evolved, and if you can weave your family story in with the Cantine Sociale and Produttori, that would be great. And then we'll get to your story and embarrass you afterwards.
My usual joke is that my family doesn't own the Produttori winery, but probably the Produttori winery owns the family, because we've always been linked with this winery very strictly. So basically the first wine cooperative, if you want to call it so, founded in Barbaresco was founded in 1894. So 120 years ago and plus, 130. And it was founded in the castle of Barbaresco in the center of the village by the owner of the castle, Mr. Domizio Cavazza, which is considered the father of Barbaresco, because not only he convinced 9 landowners of the village to bring their Nebbiolo grapes to the castle in order to make wine together, but he also started to put this wine on the market with the name of the village, Barbaresco, as they were doing in the neighboring Barolo area since 50 years or so. So the first attempt to make Barbaresco competing or standing up there with Barolo was done by Mr. Cavazza in 1894, and it was basically a cooperative, probably because he didn't have enough land to make his own wines in the castle, or maybe because he was very busy in those days. He was the director of the wine school of Alba as well. We like to think because he was a very generous person, so he put together these 9 landowners, and among these 9 landowners, it was my great-grandfather. So among the 9 founders of the first Cantina Sociale was also Mr. Giuseppe Vacca, which was my great-grandfather.
Wow.
And that winery, which was quite quintessential and established Barbaresco as a real wine, was closed in the 20s after Mr. Cavazza died in 1913, and then we had First World War, of course. And then after that, the winery didn't exist anymore. So the farmers went back to selling their grapes to large wineries or negociants. With the exception of the Gaja winery, they started to establish themselves as a fine wine producer in those years between the 2 wars. But basically in the 50s, Barbaresco was still a village of poor farmers, growing many grapes, not just Nebbiolo, of course, and selling those grapes in the open market, making very little money. So at that point, a young priest came to town in 1952. Don Fiorino was his name. And he started to see the potential of the village. And because he was the local priest, so he had enough charisma, he was able to convince, again, 19 families this time, 19,
wow,
to group together, build a winery next to the church where the Produttori winery still stands, and start once again to make wine together instead of selling grapes. with the goal of making a little extra profit. Of course, when you make wine, you reach two important goals. First, you don't have to sell it right away. When you sell grapes, you have 72 hours and after you're picking, and then you either sell them or you throw them away. But if you make wine, then no, you can wait 2 months, 3 months, even 1 year, and see if somebody is offering more money. So you have a little more leverage on the market. And then, of course, the 19 families that joined, at that point, both my grandfathers from both sides of my families, the Vaccas and the Boffas, were among the 19 founders that decided to follow the priest idea, because the priest not only pushed them to make wine together, but also convinced them to take that revolutionary decision to make only Barbaresco, no Barbera.
Yeah,
no
I wanted to ask about that because a few things. First of all, Barbaresco is 100% Nebbiolo.
Yes.
But it is not the only grape that is grown in the Barbaresco region. And I'm curious to know how they decided. It was a brilliant thing, but they were so smart to just focus on Nebbiolo and the brand of Barbaresco.
Yes.
Why did they decide to do that and not Barbera and Dolcetto, which honestly might have sold better,
Exactly,
right? Because
exactly.
they were ready earlier and all the locals drank it.
Yeah. In those days, the Dolcetto was the local drink of local people. The Barbera was believe it or not, was the common everyday wine in Genova and in Milano and Torino. So Barbera grapes and Dolcetto grapes were easy to sell, as well as the wines,
Right.
because that was what people were drinking. Barbaresco wine was limited to special events, such as weddings or anniversaries. And in those special events, it was a second choice to Barolo. So to confine your production to Barbaresco only, from a business point of view, was kind of a suicide for a winery. In fact, even these days, we are the only winery that makes only Barbaresco. But the priest had this idea to bring Barbaresco back where it belonged, because in the village, the memory of the first cantina sociale in the castle with Mr. Cavazza making wines that rivals Barolo was still quite alive. So it was like a golden age for the village. So the priest told the farmers, keep your Dolcetto grapes on, keep your Barbera grapes on, keep on selling those grapes to whoever you're selling them now, but bring to the winery that we're going to build in the middle of the village only the Nebbiolo, because we're going to make only Barbaresco, and we're going to bring Barbaresco back where Cavazza put it 60 years before, side by side with Barolo. This is like the beautiful legacy. Of course, there was also a more economical reason behind the fact that the 19 farmers agreed to that. Probably, the 19 farmers volunteered to group together and make wine together, but they were not really sure if the business were going to succeed. So keeping on their Dolcetto, keeping on their Barbera was a way to have an escape route in case the winery didn't succeed. To tell you the truth,
that's a good idea.
In the same year, or maybe the year after, a similar cooperative was founded in the village of Neve, next to Barbaresco, but after 4 years they closed it because it didn't work. So the combination of the priest vision and the farmers understanding that, okay, we make Barbaresco, the Dolcetto, the Barbera, we keep on making it home, gave to the Produttori this unique characteristic of being a monovarietal winery in a region, in a land, Piedmont, where growing many grapes and making many wines is the traditional way for a winery to be on the market.
There's so many native grapes, an infinite number being rediscovered all the time. It's pretty amazing. But you just mentioned the failure of another co-op. And let's just be honest, and you and I have discussed this before, and you don't like to say this, but most co-ops are terrible. They are lazy. They make bad wine. Even now with improved technology, they'll take any grapes. And most of the time when you see a co-op, you can expect that there's either going to be wild variation, meaning some of the wines will be good and some of them will be plonk, or they're just not that great. What is it about the Produttori? And I think I told you this. I interviewed Domaine Vacca, the other very successful co-op in Europe, and they look up to you. They look up to you and they think this is the most successful group in Europe that does this, probably in the world. What is the structure and how has this managed to take on the epic proportions that it has taken on and continue to push Barbaresco to the top of the bunch? I'll tell you, I've told you this before, I prefer Barbaresco to Barolo, and people say that they agree. I mean, this is no longer a weird thing to say. I feel like when I first started saying that, people thought it was weird, but Barbaresco is often preferred to your neighbor. So I think a lot of this has to do with the Produttore. So talk about the structure and how you have managed this quality juggernaut.
Yeah, thank you. That decision to make only Barbaresco proved quintessential because in a way forced the winery to produce quality and forced the farmers to build a quality mindset. In the years, the 60s, the 70s, when the money was to be made in quantity, this winery started to focus on quality because Barbaresco didn't have the mass market like Dolcetto, Barbera, or Chianti, or other wines. If you decide to make only Barbaresco, you force yourself in the fine wine category. So you force yourself to produce quality, the best possible quality every year, because people are not looking for cheap, low quality Barbaresco, as they may look for cheap, low quality Chianti or Barbera. Now, on the market, you can find it at $3 Chianti or a $30 bottle of Chianti. But when it comes to Barbaresco, you tend to be in the high end. So that decision was fundamental. Then we always keep the farmers very much involved with the day by day or the structure of the winery. We have now 53 farmers, so it's not a big number. Every 3 years, the 53 farmers meet. Well, they meet more often, but once every 3 years in one of their meetings, they vote, 9 of them to be the board. And the board, the 9 farmers, choose one of them to be the president. So the president, the board meet with myself and the winemaker every month, and we take all the major decisions together. So the board is always very much on top of what's going on. Is, of course, they mostly follow my advice or the winemaker advice, but it's their decision what to do, what to buy, how to sell the wine. So by keeping the farmers very much linked with the day-by-day life of the winery, we give them a sense of belonging that I think is important. It makes them feel important. That's also why generation after generation, the new kids, they stay on board, and they very few actually left to start their own winery. Most of them are still, the families go pass from generation to generation. They stay as member of the Produttori del Barbaresco. And then, of course, when it comes to paying the grapes that they deliver to the winery, we always reward quality and not just quantity. And we have done that since day one. The payment according to quality, which is a very common sense thing to do or to say these days, was another revolutionary step that was taken in 1958 when the winery was founded. Every load of grapes that comes to the winery is weighted, crushed, a sample is taken, and the quality is checked these days by measuring the sugar, color, and tannins. And so the higher quality, the more money per pound or per kilo of grapes is given to the farmer. So every farmer is very focused in producing the best possible quality, because with the quality also comes a higher payment of the grapes. In fact, we don't really pay grapes. We share profit because the farmers are really shareholders. They are owners of the winery. So the more land they own, the more money, of course, they're going to make. But the better is the quality, the larger will be the piece of the share that belongs to them. Doing this now year after year since 1958 really was another step for keeping the farmers extremely focused on quality. Behind all these decisions that were taken and the vision of the priest, the vision of my father, that was the first director from 58 to 84, beside all this, the number one reason of the success is probably the land that we control. Our farmers can claim ownership on some of the best vineyards in Barbaresco, which is quite unusual for a cooperative. Usually, every appellation you go in Europe, you find wine cooperatives, but they tend to have more what you say, village wine, like the Grand Crus, the great vineyard.
Lower.
Yeah, belong to the private families. In Barbaresco, the local cooperatives, Produttori, really owns large pieces of the best vineyards. So now when you start with the great vineyards, great terroir, then everything comes from there, of course.
We'll take a step away from this amazing show with Aldo Vacca from the Produttori del Barbaresco to talk about our sponsors this week. First of all, have you ever thought about how the podcast gets produced? Each week, we make something out of nothing, and it takes a lot of hours and a lot of time. If you like the show, just remember that there's a lot of effort that goes on behind it, and if you would like to see it keep going, you can join Patreon. patreon.com/wine for normal people is how you can join the community. You get lots of benefits and perks, and it also helps fund the content that you listen to each week. If you're interested in taking classes, there's a bunch of new classes up, winefornormalpeople.com/classes. And we also need to thank our sponsor, The Wine Spies, who also makes it possible for us to keep the podcast free for you to listen. So please do support them as they support us. The Wine Spies are a flash sale, one deal per day site. They are not a wine club. You buy what you want when you want, and that can include things like Barolo and Barbaresco, Nebbiolo from Longa, Nebbiolo d'Alba, all sorts of interesting things from Piedmont, plus things from California, Spain, France, you name it, they've got it. They take the guesswork out of finding a great bottle. They taste through hundreds of samples and only put up the best. Every single day, they offer a new wine. If you like it, you add it to your cart. You can buy 1 or 2 bottles at checkout, add it to your locker. When you get 12, they'll ship it to you for free. They feature a wide range of interesting wines. The only obligation you have is to sign up for the email. Go to winespies.com/normalwine, spies.com/normal to get $20 off your first order. If you want to score great wines for a low price, up to a 75% discount, do it today. winespies.com/normal. Now let's get back to the show. Can you talk about the logistics? I remember when we brought the group to come see you on the Piedmont trip, you were talking about how things happen at harvest and the line that people have to form. So you have to manage the logistics.
Yeah.
I think it must be so stressful. Although you've done it for so long, it probably is no longer that stressful. But people are coming at the same time with truckloads of grapes that have to be crushed and evaluated. And you have you and your staff, and then you've got the winemaker.
Yes.
How did the winemaker get selected, by the way? Does everyone have to agree that that person is the right person?
Yeah, the board does those things. So we have a head winemaker that is the head winemaker since 1986, so a long time. And since 6 years now, we have a second in command winemaker. So now we have 2 full-time winemakers working at the winery together. And of course, we have only 1 grape, so that keeps things simpler in a way. Let's say there is a well-oiled machine that we are managing now. So if the weather is good and sunny, then the harvest goes very smoothly. Of course, if rains and fog comes, then it's a little more chaotic. But basically, like at the beginning of September, we start sampling grapes, berries in the vineyards, look at the sugar level, pH, acidity. And when we think we are approaching maturation, we call a general meeting of all the growers, all the farmers. And we show them
all 53?
All 53. We meet
oh my gosh.
at the winery. This year we met on September 15, and we show them the sampling. Sometimes it can be October 3rd, October 4th, depending on the season. We show them the result of the sampling in the vineyards. Now we discuss a bit of the weather that is coming, issues that are in the fields. And then kind of together we decide the day that we're going to start the crushing of the grapes. Usually they go with our suggestion, but they basically have to agree. So basically when they leave the meeting, they know that on October 4th, let's say, we say, put the crushing machine out, because we literally take over the main square of the village, and we put this big crushing machine in the middle of the square in front of the winery. Now, remember, as you know, Barbaresco is basically one street village that dead ends where the Produttori.
So small.
Yeah. So it can be really congested. So in that given day, the machine, the stemmer is out. So they start to pick the grapes in small boxes. They pile up those boxes on their tractors and they drive to the winery. Until a few years ago, the line could be all the way from the bottom to the end of the village. Quite beautiful scene in a way. But But a little chaotic, as you said.
Yes.
Since 4 years now, technology helped us. We created an app, as you can say. So each farmer on his cell phone has a Produttori app. When they have a full load ready to come, they go on the app and they book a timing.
So, this is genius.
Yeah, let's say at 11 o'clock in the morning, they have a load ready. They go on the app and they book a crush at 3 o'clock. And so they come to the winery 20 minutes before their timing. So in any given moment of the day.
That is brilliant. Did you think of that? That seems like something you would think
it's actually my winemaker, the young winemaker, actually. But yeah.
Okay.
Of course,
it's brilliant. I love that. What a great use of technology.
And the farmers get even smarter than that. Now what they do, they go on the app and they book a timing. And then according to the timing they have, they start picking. So in order not to have the grapes to wait too long. So normally they come at the winery. There can be 2-3 tractors here. It's still quite a scene if as a tourist you come and see, but it's not like the 20 or 25 tractors lining up and taking over completely the village.
I love that.
It's usually first week of October is the time that we pick, although every year can change. This year was particularly early, so you never know until the very end when is the harvest time. But normally for us, 120 hectares of Nebbiolo grapes. In 10, 12 days, the harvest is over. So it's quite smooth and fast. We crush grapes from 6 in the morning to midnight, and in less than 2 weeks, we close the vintage.
That is a lot of work, but it's in a concentrated time frame.
Exactly.
One thing that you really focus on is knowledge sharing between the members and helping them with technology and setting standards. Do you have any rules about pesticides, herbicides, things that they're not allowed to do, how they have to work the vineyards, and how do people interact with each other so that they can improve?
Yeah, we strongly push them of being very sustainable in their viticulture practices, which they normally do anyway. So fertilization mainly with manure or natural fertilizer, and minimum quantity usually is done before planting a new vineyard and then every 4 or 5 years as a help. Disease control, which is mainly fungus in this part of the world, so mildew and downy mildew and powder mildew, is done mainly with copper and sulfur or similar products. And we try to push them to keep them to a minimum. Of course, the season here, especially spring, can be very unpredictable. So this year, because it was being so dry, the pest control was very easy and was really, really low key. When you have multiple rain in the spring and in the early summer, then you have to treat a little more often. But everything is done with low key impact pesticide. No insecticide are used. For a couple of insects that can cause problem, we have what is called the pheromone control. So it's like a natural way to control these insects by parasites.
The brown thing you put at the end of on the wires, right?
And we do that as a community. So we do a collective buying of whatever is necessary to control, and we give them free to our growers, so they can get the low impact pest control for free by the winery, and that dissuades them from buying maybe more poisoning treatment, because they can have the low impact one for free from us rather than going and buying the big one. In general, no, these farmers are small farmers. They own 2, 3, 10 acres. So they do the work in the vineyards. So basically they live in the vineyards every day of the year almost. And their kids play among the vines. So they're pretty naturally sustainable, because the air they breathe is the air of their vineyards. They don't like to use strong pest control, because they literally live and work in their vineyards every day of the year.
The Produttori owns some land, right? Haven't you been left land by people who have passed away, and you've acquired some land, been given land?
Yeah,
not right.
Yeah, not much.
I remember you telling me that.
Some other cooperatives own more than us. We always had the policy not to buy land ourselves, but try to, whenever a farmer wants to sell, we try to have him sell it to another farmer. So the land remains in the Produttori, but the ownership stays with the farmer. So we just have a couple of acres that they ended up being owned by the Produttori. one of the growers or a couple of growers are taking care of them as so they kind of rent it from us. But in general, we push our growers whenever they're ready to sell to tell us, and then we try to have them sell to another grower. No, this thing is getting challenging because price of land is increasing, not as much as in Barolo, but also here. So sometimes when you have people from outside that come and offer a lot of money, it's a little more difficult. But we are trying, especially from the top vineyard, to stay on top of that. And we may in the future buy more land directly as Produttori if it's necessary, and then have some of the growers working it as it is.
Yeah, it's so hard to balance the financial incentives that people will offer for Barbaresco because it's so small, and then people wanting to stay true to their roots. Let's discuss this. So you wound up in your past working for Gaja, who it's undoubtedly true that Gaja has really done a lot for the reputation of Barbaresco. However, they make, in my opinion, a very undecidedly Barbaresco. Their wines don't necessarily always reflect the uniqueness of site, although the wines are quite good. So when you worked there, just even for a very brief time, did you feel like you just wanted to go back to being more terroir driven? I mean, what made you take this job?
Yeah, in a way, a little bit like that. Of course, as I said before, my family has always been very strongly linked with the Produttori. Not only I still have my cousins now, which are growers. My grandfathers were among the founders. My father was a director from 58, so year 1 to 84 when he retired.
Wow.
I started working at Gaja in 1986, and I worked there for 4 years. It was my first job. So
right.
It's like for a mechanic engineer, first job working at Ferrari. It's kind of difficult where I'm gonna go after this, because you start from the top. It's not easy to go anywhere else. So I went back to my roots, basically. I worked there from 86 to 1990. Those were the years in this region in Piedmont where a lot of experimentation was done with the new varietal Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay. Gaja was among the first planting some of those vineyards and making those wines here. Experimentation with small barrels, new oak, like French style. And so
lots of oak.
Yeah, and Gaja was very much one of the front runner in that style. And it really didn't suit my personality. So although it was a great job and I learned a lot, and although the wines were excellent, but I felt like it was time for me to go back to a more rural or a little more simpler way of winemaking, which in times, 20 years later, is now the fashionable way to do wine. So all the producers in the region, they went to new oak and blend and new varietal. Everybody's coming back to Nebbiolo and more neutral aging and less manipulation. So the fact that I went back to Produttori because I wanted to make wine in a more simpler way, or you can say natural, but I don't like to use the natural word because it creates in a simpler way. More like hand off. Like the Gaja wines, like
the traditional way, the way that reflects the land, terroir driven.
Exactly. The wines made in this area in the 90s by the most famous producers were not very good. They wanted to make like signature wines. Like now, everybody's back to make more wines that reflect the vintage, the terroir, and not really the winemaker idea, which it's what I prefer in a way.
What would you say is the trademark of Barbaresco? If someone has never had a Barbaresco before and we're discussing this and they're thinking, this guy sounds pretty cool, I'd like to try one of these wines, how would you describe it?
It's a wine that is very complex, but also never heavy. So a light impact on the palate with an extremely long, complex finish. There is even more than Barolo in that aspect. So Barbaresco really have this beautiful complexity. It delivers power, but always in an elegant way. That's pretty much what it is. Then if you become more on the organoleptic character, it's a combination of red cherry aromas with nice spicy flavors. The white pepper, the anise, combined with the red cherry and violet kind of gives this very vibrant character on the palate, but it's never filling the palate completely. It's always kind of vertical on the middle palate, kind of stands up and hits the upper palate more than filling your mouth completely. When you swallow the good Barbaresco, but this is true also for many other wines, what we call the retrogusto, the aftertaste, is very long. You almost feel like the wine doesn't want to go down through your throat. It's kind of hanging to your tongue because it wants to stay there for minutes, really. This very long, intense complexity that comes back and evolves at the end of your palate. Once the wine is already swallowed down, it's what intrigues me more about Barbaresco, and is very much true of Barbaresco. Sometime on the palate, on the middle palate, when you hold the wine on your palate for a few seconds, Barbaresco may feel a little simple, but then when you swallow, it really comes back in a powerful way.
Yes. And it is not overly tannic. I think it has tannin.
Yes.
But there is much more to it. That is what I like about it, is that it's a bit softer than Barolo, and that allows the flavors to shine.
Exactly.
The tannin isn't so harsh.
And this is very much true these days. This new climate we are having is making the tannins slightly riper, and so therefore a little more gentle on the finish. I remember Barbarescos from the 70s, from the 80s, not bigger, but more sharp, more aggressive. Mm-hmm. We said the tannins were greener, and now the tannins are definitely riper. So the vintages from the new millennium, especially from this last decade, from 2008 to these days, when they are 5-6 years old, they're very beautiful to drink, which is a big plus, because it's hard to wait 15 or 20 years to drink a bottle of wine these days.
It's true. A couple of questions for you. First of all, you make affordable Longa Nebbiolo that people can buy and enjoy. You don't have to do that. You could just put it all into Barbaresco. Why do you do that?
The Longa Nebbiolo, which is basically the second wine for Barbaresco, for us, 100% Nebbiolo from Barbaresco, we started to make it in the middle of the 70s, when we actually had grapes which were not fit to be Barbaresco because they were too light or too simple. So the Longa Nebbiolo became a thing to do in order to select the best grapes for Barbaresco and the less good grapes for Longa Nebbiolo. Now, as you said, almost every year, the grapes are all good to be Barbaresco. They have enough alcohol, enough fruit. But we still like to make Longa Nebbiolo, although sometimes we make less when the vintage is exceptionally good. Sometimes we make more, but it's still 20-25% of our total production, because it's a good way to introduce people to Barbaresco, to the Nebbiolo grape, for a reasonable price. People can order it, enjoy it, and understand the quintessential character of the grape, because it delivers the characteristic, the spicy cherry fruit, in a very simple, vibrant, young way, because the wine basically is bottled 1 year after the harvest and just spends a short summer in a large barrel. So it doesn't really have a lot of influence at all from the wood. So it's a good introduction to Barbaresco. And it's a good way to use the grapes on the young vineyards, because young vines usually, they ripe grapes very well, but they don't give a lot of complexity. Technically, by the book, you can use young vines to make Barbaresco wine, but it's nice to use the first, second, even third harvest from a new vineyard to make a simpler, younger wine. And then when the vineyard is 7-8 years old, start to use the grapes to make Barbaresco. So there's a number of reasons. And then, of course, once you establish a market, there is a demand, wine by the glass in many restaurants around the world. So the Longa Nebbiolo, it's a good service we do to our customers, and we like the wine.
It's a gift. It is definitely one of the best Longa Nebbiolos. Why did you do Longa instead of Nebbiolo d'Alba?
Because in the Barbaresco region, when you drop down, if you have Barbaresco grapes, those are the grapes that officially are from the Barbaresco appellation. If you want to drop down, you drop down to Longa Nebbiolo. Nebbiolo d'Alba, you have to declare your vineyard as Nebbiolo d'Alba to start with. When you make Barbaresco, then after 6 months the wine is made, you decide to go down, then you go to Longa Nebbiolo. And then, of course, the cuisine of the region. When you have a carne cruda or a vitello tonnato, those appetizers, I think they are very good for Longa Nebbiolo. Like Barbaresco maybe is better with a warm pasta or a main course, but those rich cold appetizer of the region are fantastic with the Longa Nebbiolo. So it's good wine to start the meal with.
I don't want you to talk about all 9 cru, but when we talk about the differences between them, Can you give people sort of a summary of why they express things that are so different? What is it about the terroir within this very, very small region that makes each of these wines so different? And every time that you taste them, it's really quite striking. It's the same exact grape, same year. It's in a very small area, but just the influence of the slopes or distance from the Tanaro or all of the things. Could you just talk about that so people can really understand?
Yes, the village of Barbaresco on the west side borders the valley and the river. So basically, the hills on the west side of Barbaresco merge down into the river and the valley floor. Like on the east side, they go like 2-3 miles away from the valley, from the river. The microclimate changes a little bit, but also the soil, because in general, the soil is compact soil, combination of clay and calcium with some sandy veins. Okay, so the calcium content, though, can vary from 12% to 25% of the total texture. And the higher is the calcium, the most tannic, tight, and powerful will be the wine. So let's say, take, for example, Pora, which is usually the first in the lineup that I put when we taste the single vineyards. It's a beautiful vineyard that is basically facing the river, very open on the river, gets a little humidity, a little moisture, a little extra fertility in the soil, and a little less calcium. So the wines are more gentle, the tannins are not too strong, the flavors on the palate are broader rather than tight and deep. They're more like broad and they feel kind of a round up. While if you go east on another famous vineyard, for example, Monte Stefano, the calcium content is up to 22%, very steep, less fertility in the soil. The wine delivered as a bigger body, a little more thick, a little more chewy texture on the palate, and definitely stronger tannic finish. Now, when you put them side by side, it becomes very clear.
Yes.
Standing alone in the one single glass, it's not that easy to pick up the difference because the 9 single vineyards that we produce, and of course, they're all Barbaresco, and also very important, they are vinified and aged exactly in the same way. Our point in the winery is not to try to mellow down the tannins if they are too strong or try to enrich the fruit if it's not too strong. Our point in the winery is just to show the way they are with their minus and their plus, usually more plus than minus. But so those differences become intriguing and interesting because the winemaker is not trying to manipulate them. He's just trying to show them. And that's, I think, is the beauty of the horizontal tasting of our single vineyards.
And you use huge barrels. I mean, you use botti.
Yes.
You don't use small barrels. There's none of that. So it really is quite standard. I do have to say the Monte Stefano is my favorite.
It's quite full and rich and concentrated. For example, we have a small vineyard. It's called Paillet. And it always strikes me.
Oh, that's an excellent wine, too.
It's not as big, it's not as powerful, but it has this phenomenal light, floral, aromatic character in the nose. No, very, It's nice to see those differences. Of course, it's also nice to blend everything together, but they are so unique and so delicate that it's nice to show the difference from one vineyard to the other. It's kind of fascinating to do that with this grape.
Yes.
The Nebbiolo grape picks the terroir more than a Barbera or Dolcetto. When you grow Barbera or Dolcetto, the varietal fruit tends to be more dominant. With the Nebbiolo, is the terroir specific that is stronger than the actual fruit character of the grape itself.
It really is amazing how reflective of the terroir it is. Nebbiolo somehow, or Barolo and Barbaresco somehow got the reputation, I think it's through Gaja, that they are huge wines and they're big and powerful. And I usually describe them like they're like the flip side of Riesling, or the flip side of Burgundy.
Exactly.
They're not Cabernet. Definitely
not.
Yeah,
people expect them to be big, but they're not big. They're complex, but they always tend to be relatively elegant and intense, but not overwhelming. It's not an overwhelming feeling when you're in a Nebbiolo-based wine. It's always more intriguing, intriguing experience. Exactly. Yeah, I know that occasionally some restaurants around the world, they, instead of offering a wine by the glass, they offer a fly of 3 Barbaresco Produttori single vineyards, like half a glass. So you have the 3 glasses with the Pora, the Monte Stefano, and the Asidi, for example. And it's kind of a nice way to introduce people to the terroir concept, because you have like 3 tastings. It's basically the same wine. You can match with the same food, but you can see the little nuances that make Monte Stefano different from Pora, etc.
And they are big differences.
Yeah.
So 2 last questions. One is a quick one. How long can Barbaresco age? And I'm talking about ideally not, I feel like sometimes people become so obsessed with aging that they forget to drink wine when it's ready. So
exactly.
Can you set them straight?
That's also a thing that I think has been changing through the years. The vintages from the 70s, the 60s, they were really difficult to enjoy before they were at least 10 years old. And then they stayed in the barrels. Like last week, I had a 74. It was old, but it was still drinkable, and it has a beautiful, fresh finish. So they kind of aged for 40 years and plus. The vintages...
That's almost 50 years.
Yeah, exactly. It's I think is a common way to say it, but I remember my father saying that up to 20 years, there are several good vintages. After 20 years, there are few good bottles. Because after 20 years, the bottle variation becomes also quite important. So you may get lucky and get a bottle is 50 years old, like the one I had from 74, and still drinkable, and maybe the next bottle is that. But I would say that the vintages until the middle of the 90s, they could really age, 40 years, but they were difficult to enjoy young. The vintages of the new millennium, especially the last 15 years, I find them peaking when they are 10, 12 years and really reaching their best at 15, 20. Already drinkable at 6, so an earlier drinkability window. I have doubt that these wines can actually hold for 40 or 50 years. I hope they will surprise me, as Nebbiolo-based wine often do. But, I mean, the 2011, 2008, 2005, I have in the cellar. If you have any of those, I will drink them before 20, 25 years. Because it seems to me that they tend to be a little more... The drinkability window has been anticipating. So 5 years of age, already enjoyable, 10, 12, 15 years, perfect peak of maturation. But the Nebbiolo-based
wine... There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, that's great.
Sometimes the Nebbiolo kind of reaches a peak, let's say at 12, 15 years of age, then it starts to go down, but then reaches a point where then it stays. So you have the feeling that you taste the wine that is a little too old maybe, but it's not dead. And it goes on along. So at that point, some people like the old, earthy aromas of the mature wines. And some people can appreciate the younger version of these wines when they still deliver the fresh fruit.
There's so few wines that can age for that amount of time that it's amazing that you had something from 1974 and it's still good, because there's a lot of sweet wines and Rieslings and things like that can go a long time. Bordeaux, obviously.
Yes.
But most everything besides Barbaresco, Barolo, and Bordeaux in the world of red wines, it's going to be really hard for anything to outlast those 3 regions.
Exactly.
And it's just the way that it goes. All right. My last question for you is, what are you excited about right now? Or what are you most proud of that has happened recently with the Produttori?
The fact that the new generations, the young guys, the young kids, they stay in the family. They seems to have no intention of going solo and starting their own winery. They're happy to be part of Produttori. It means a lot for me, because it means that they did a good job, and we did a good job here. And it means that they are very proud of what we are doing, because now with the reputation of the wine of this region in general, Barbaresco in particular, with the value of the land and the demand for a grower with 4 or 5 acres of land in a vineyard like Rabaya or Monte Stefano, it seems almost natural to start his own winery and start to make his own brand. But that has not been happening the last 20 years. So it gives me a sense of proudness that I must do something good with these people, which is good. A sense of community that has been working and makes everybody happy. They make a good money for the work they do, and they're happy to stay as part of Produttori.
And again, to embarrass you, one of the things that I think you have done so successfully is because you have a great personality. You've been a great ambassador for the region and for the brand. There's a lot of prestige in being associated with the Produttori. And there is, I think, less prestige in being an okay Barbaresco producer than being somebody who is part of the Produttore, because you have done this. You have wound up managing all parts of it. And the environment has changed dramatically since you took over in the early 90s. And you have managed to really navigate and bring Barbaresco, not just the Produttore, but all of Barbaresco, to a level that, like I said, I mean, who would have thought that Barbaresco could sort of stand on its own without Barolo? And it's not really the big brother anymore. Barbaresco is its own entity. I think that's really a big change. And I think that you should be proud of that, even.
I thank you. Yes. And I can feel that the growers feel the same. So, it's kind of it's a good feeling. Let's hope it lasts, and let's hope we keep on doing a good job.
Of course you will. Well, Aldo, you are amazing. I just am so happy to know you. I get so much information every time I talk to you. You're just the best emissary for Barbaresco that there could possibly be. If you are listening to this and you have any opportunity ever to meet Aldo, please do it. He is just as good as he sounds, and even better in person, because he's got a wicked sense of humor too. And the wines are spectacular. So Aldo, thank you so much. It took me a few years to get you here, but I finally nailed you down and you delivered. You are fantastic.
I'm glad we did it. Very, very happy.
Me too.
And I hope to see you soon.
You are great.
In Barbaresco.
Oh, you'll see me soon. I'll see you. And if anybody's interested, we're taking another trip to Piedmont in fall of 2023. Hop on board, get in touch with me if you're a patron. It's a patron-only trip, but if you're a patron, sign up. Thank you, Aldo, again.
Thank you.
With that, this has been another episode of Wine for Normal People. Thank you so much for listening, and we will catch you next time.
Thank you.